Okay, so the recording is on. Right. So let me just pull up my notes. Okay, great. Hello and welcome to the New Voices in Global Security Lunchtime Seminar Series. My name is Dr. Amanda Chisholm, and I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Security Studies, researching and teaching on gender and war in both the Department of Defense Studies and War Studies. And I will be the chair for today. We are so pleased to have our second PhD seminar presenter, Abigail Grace, speak to us about her research titled Understanding Alignment in China's New Era of International Relations. The talk is based upon a working paper that Abby is working through. In this paper, she asks, how can the bilateral relationships forged under Beijing's concept of the global network of partnerships be contextualized within the broader international relations literature on alliances? Using a quantitative approach, her paper characterizes 35 key Chinese bilateral relationships and proposes a new index-based framework for categorizing and comparing these relationships. Through this approach, Abby facilitates a more complete assessment of the commonalities and differences between China's partnership and theoretical concepts of alliance, enabling more rigorous future balance of power assessment of China's geopolitical reach. Abigail Grace is a PhD candidate in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Her research focuses on China's evolving approach to alignment and seeks to bring China's foreign policy preferences into dialogue with existing conceptions of alliances in international relations literature. Abigail Grace is joined by Dr. Alessio Patalano. Dr. Patalano is a reader in East Asian warfare at King's College London. He specializes in maritime strategy and doctrine, Japanese military history and strategy, East Asian security, and Italian defense policy. From 2006 to 2015, he was a visiting professor in strategy at the Italian Naval War College in Venice. In Japan, Dr. Patalano has also been a visiting professor at a variety of different institutes and colleges. And at KCL is the director of the Asian Security and Warfare Research Group, the leading UK forum for research and education on East Asia, and the King's Japan program. Dr. Patalano is also a senior fellow with the Royal United Services Institute and at Policy Exchange, leading think tanks on defense and security matters in the UK. His current research focuses on maritime security, Chinese hybrid strategy and maritime coercion, Sino-Japanese maritime territorial disputes, and the relationship between military power and statecraft in Japan. So you can see we have another amazing lineup of colleagues here. What a treat for us. As usual, before I give the floor over to Ms. Grace, can I just ask everyone to again mute their mics? And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to pop them in the chat box or just wait till the question and answer session and you can raise your hand or you can pop questions there as well. After Abigail's presentation, which is about 20 minutes, Alessio will offer some reflections on the paper and presentation, and then we'll turn it over to you, the audience, to ask all those tough and interesting questions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to you, Abigail.
Great, well, thanks so much for having me today. I'm gonna see if I can share my screen here and get some slides up, so bear with me 1 second. All right. Does everything look to be going well? We'll assume so. Okay, great. So my talk today is on understanding alignment in China's new era of international relations. And just a disclaimer here, the work that I'm presenting today is in my own personal capacity as a PhD candidate at King's and does not reflect the view of the US government. All right, it's not wanting to. So first, an overview of the talk today. We'll be talking about the research question that I've defined, comparing alliance, alignment, and partnerships, which are actually 3 distinct concepts, so the terms are used interchangeably. Next, I'll provide an overview of my typology framework, which focuses on both fixed and dynamic alignment. I'll talk about the variables, indicators, and data sources that I'm using. Then I will present sort of the distribution of the typology, and then I'll conclude with sharing my preliminary findings, conclusions, and next steps. So first, the research question for today is, why did China begin to pursue a policy of partnership diplomacy in 2014? And what types of alignment does China exhibit within these partnerships? And what I think is critical here to discuss is that in 2014, there was actually a rather spirited debate within China's own IR field about whether or not it was appropriate for China to continue adhering to the non-alignment movement, as they had for several decades, or whether or not, as China continued to, grow in its own power, whether that be economic, military, diplomatic, it made more sense for them to adopt what could be called a more alliance-focused foreign policy. And so there were differing opinions sort of across the spectrum within China's own IR field. And eventually what happened is in 2014, at the Central Foreign Affairs Work Conference, President Xi articulated this new strategy of a global network of partnerships. So what this was sort of telegraphed as is taking a middle road, whereas China would not be formally walking away from its non-aligned perspective. It wouldn't be, embracing alliances wholesale, but at the same time, it did acknowledge that it was logical for China to begin pursuing these partnerships in a more systematic way. So here I put together a little graph that talks about alliance, alignment, security communities, and other terminological concepts. And so what I would start by saying is frequently, certainly within newspapers and even sometimes within official government statements, you see commentators refer to folks as allies. So you'll see commonly in newspapers, China and Pakistan be referred to as allies. This is actually not accurate at all. The US has this misconception as well. Sometimes it refers to close security partners as allies. And what is really clear to differentiate at the start is that an ally is a formal security commitment, a treaty arrangement that exists between two parties. Alignment is a much broader concept that can encompass anything from a non-aggression pact to an entente to a security community that all together are varying shades and forms of this broader concept of alignment. So here are the definitions that I sort of use throughout the paper. First, alignment is this community of interest calling for common policies and actions. So I think this definition is particularly important because in ways it acknowledges that alignment is not necessarily just military or security oriented in nature. There are definitely political interests that can lead two parties to be aligned. There are broader economic interests, one could even say, whereas the definition for alliance that's being used, the formal association of states for the use or non-use of military force, is very clear that this is a discrete security relationship. And I think that understanding that these two concepts are interrelated, so in the sense alliance is a type of alignment, is important, that they're nested, but they're not totally analogous. So here I put together a list of China's own partnerships. So the way that China's foreign ministry tends to classify its different types of partnerships is in a way hierarchical. So you can see here at the top of the list, we have what's called a friendly cooperative relationship, which is included within its formal designations of partnerships, but certainly would not, in my opinion, be a very strong indicator of alignment. Whereas sort of at the bottom of this list, you have the all-weather strategic cooperative partnership, which is the specific term that China has assigned to its relationship with Pakistan that does indicate a much stronger degree of alignment. So over the course of China's bilateral relationships, over 100 relationships have been assigned one of these various terms. But what this project really hopes to get at is it's not clear that the assignment of these terms necessarily correlates to any sort of discrete outcomes in the bilateral relationship, or even that assigning this term to China's relationship with another country means anything more other than that they've decided to set up certain dialogue mechanisms. So the purpose of this project is really to understand how China's own discussion about what its bilateral relationships look like and how this new global network of partnerships fits in with this rich theoretical IR literature that we have talking about alliances, alignment, and what that means for the broader trajectory of international relations and the balance of power. So the approach that I'm taking this research is, again, first to contextualize these relationships within the field. And secondly, this is a quantitative approach. So I do prioritize examining discrete measurable facts about China's bilateral relationships. Again, this goes back to not necessarily just accepting this terminology and saying that this Chinese term of a security partnership equates an entente. No, instead, this approach definitely focuses on looking at the discrete outcomes associated with these relationships. And then finally, I endeavored to identify where there are differences and similarities between China's current partnership behavior and existing alignment and alliance behavior that we've seen historically. And the goal of this is to understand, to what degree is what China doing truly new or novel? Is it a new approach that we should then update our own conceptual thinkings of what IR literature says, or is what we're seeing just an evolution of something that has already been exhibited? So my typology framework employs two sets of variables. So the first set of variables are what I call fixed variables. These are things that are unlikely to change over a 10 to 15 year time horizon. In many ways, they are predetermined. A country's own, independent leader cannot make decisions that generally would change their own fixed variable scores. So here we have first the existence of a shared adversary, second historical affinity or enmity, and then finally geography. The second category of variables examined are what's called dynamic. So these are things that, over a medium time horizon, individual leaders or countries can in a way make decisions about the way that their relationship with China progresses. These are things like economic dependency, regime characteristics, and the degree of military cooperation. So here you'll see sort of a straw man outcome of how these variables work together to create a quad chart that outlines the four different types of alignment that I examine. So you see here sort of in the top right-hand corner, a maximalist outcome. So these are countries that are classified as high fixed, high dynamic. You'll see that they are generally close in proximity to China. They share a regime type. They have shared adversaries. They have a high degree of economic dependency, robust military cooperation, and similar regime type. In short, these are countries that, while they are not formally designated as allies, do share many of the same characteristics that you would see between a country and a formal treaty ally. In the bottom left-hand corner, we have countries that are categorized as low fixed, low dynamic. So in a sense, these are countries that are in no way aligned with China in many situations. They're not proximate. They perhaps have feelings of historical enmity. There's no shared adversary, limited economic dependency, limited military cooperation, and they have dissimilar regime types. And the opposite two corners here, you see where these variables interact in different ways than perhaps might immediately meet the eye. So first, we'll look at the low fixed, high dynamic category. These are countries that are not necessarily destined to be aligned with China, right? They're not proximate. They perhaps have historical enmity. There's no shared adversary. But countries' leaders have made discrete decisions in their dynamic behavior through economic cooperation, military, and regime type to increase that level of alignment and cooperation. Conversely, high fixed, low dynamic is the opposite, where they do have historical linkages such as proximity, affinity, and the history of a shared adversary, but perhaps there is not as much robust economic, military, or regime type similarities. So now I'm going to walk through each of the variables examined and talk about the different indicators and data sources that I use to calculate. First is the shared adversary variable. So I use two indicators here of first, whether or not a country shared an adversary at the time that the PRC established bilateral relations with this country. And then second, whether or not they shared an adversary as of December 2019, which was the last time I updated the data. And the way that I derived this information was whether or not they had engaged in, adversarial relations against a common country using the enhanced correlates of war data set. And then similarly, for the present day, I examined statements from countries' national security leadership. For countries that do share an adversary, I coded it as a binary variable. So 10 points for shared adversary, 0 points for no shared adversary. The second variable is whether or not there's historical affinity or enmity. So the first variable, again, indicator used was whether or not the country had engaged in a conflict with the PRC, again, relying on the correlates of war data set. And then the second indicator is China's favorability rating among the population of the examined country, which I used Pew Research Center's Global Attitude Survey with the 2019 results. And so this variable I think is particularly interesting because it leverages both population sentiment, which is a bit more subject to fluctuation, while simultaneously grounding it in this discrete fact of whether or not a country has engaged in military hostilities with the PRC. The final fixed variable examined is geography. So there are 3 indicators used for the geography variable. First, whether or not there is an existence of a shared maritime or land border. Second, the physical distance between Beijing and the country's capital. And then finally, the flight distance between Beijing and the examined state's capital. And so this last indicator, flight distance, was used to sort of encapsulate the temporal sense of geography, right? To what extent do countries perceive there to be distance between Beijing and their own country? Because something could be very proximate distance-wise, but if there's not good transportation between the 2 countries, it can seem to be more far away. So now the dynamic variables. First, economic dependence. And so here I rely heavily on trade data. And what I look at here is the examined states' exports to China as a percentage of their total exports. So in many countries, this ranges anywhere from maybe 3% of their total exports are destined for China, and some countries have as high as 28 to 30% of their exports. Imports, similarly, the examined states' total imports as a percentage of their overall imports. Regime characteristics. Here I look at the examined state's regime type using the polity data series. Second, I examined rights and freedoms enjoyed by the state's citizens through the Freedom House's Freedom of the World Index. And then finally, I looked at the state's control of corruption. And for that, I used a World Bank control of corruption indicator. And the final variable examined is military cooperation. And the first indicator used there is the annualized amount of arms sales from China to another country. And I used the SIPRI database for that. I looked at the joint exercises between the PLA and the examined state. And then finally, I looked at the amount of senior level contact between China and the examined state, leveraging the National Defense University's PLA military diplomacy database for these last 2 indicators. So briefly, there are some limitations to this model. First, even though I just went through 6 variables, there are many more that could have been included in a perfect world. First, a country's voting record at the UN and other international organizations, the amount of times in which a country chose to vote in accordance with China's articulated policy preference. Another variable that could have been examined is the amount of people-to-people and party-to-party contact. And then finally, the amount of engagement that a country has with China's competitors also could have been an interesting variable. Another sort of disclaimer that I note about the model is that it shouldn't be used without supporting qualitative analysis that validates some of these quantitative findings and allows for a more detailed examination of the case-specific factors. And then finally, it can't account for sort of unexpected black swan events. Where the model does have strengths, though, is that you'll see when the data sources are put up shortly, it's sort of radiated, so you can see a differentiation even within the categories described. It also can be updated routinely to account for changes in the real world environment. So for example, I imagine that when newer trade data comes out, that might affect where Australia and South Korea sit within the model. And then finally, it does connect sort of observable facts to these theoretical concepts. So again, here's just a depiction of the model straw man formula. And here is the slide that sort of depicts where exactly countries fall when doing this quantitative analysis. So up here is the top right, which represents high fixed, high decisional countries, countries that generally exhibit a strong degree of alignment with China. Here are the high dynamic, low fixed countries, countries that don't necessarily have a historical reason to be aligned with China, but have made discrete decisions within their behavior to exhibit more cooperation. Here you have countries that are high fixed, low dynamic. And then finally, there's a very large cluster of countries that are low fixed, low dynamic, and that way are considered to be not aligned with China. So first, this is an overview of those that are classified as high dynamic, high fixed. I think it will surprise no one to see Pakistan, Russia, and North Korea showing up on this list. What is particularly interesting, I thought, was the inclusion of Indonesia within this category. And you'll see here when we go back to this broader scatter plot chart, is that this gradation, I think, is really important for the model, right? So you see that Pakistan, North Korea, and Russia are in many ways exhibiting strong quantitative features very consistent with high degrees of alignment. Whereas Indonesia, when you look at the distribution of scores, while it is classified as high fixed, high decisional, or high dynamic, excuse me, does fall lower within that chart. So some of the outcomes examined with countries classified as high fixed, high dynamic is that they do exhibit high degrees of military cooperation, they're proximate, they have historical affinity, but one thing that is important to note is that none of them do meet this formal standard of an alliance, right? Even though they do exhibit these high degrees of cooperation across all of these variables, they still do fall short of having this formal treaty alliance between Beijing and these other capitals, rendering even the most aligned relationships that China is pursuing short of these more encompassing alliance definitions that we've seen in a Western context. The second category identified were countries that were high dynamic, low fixed. Here we have Australia, Malaysia, Tanzania, and Turkey. You can see here they're distributed on the scatter plot in this bottom right-hand corner. Some of the interesting outcomes associated with these states is that none of the states within this category shared an adversary with the PRC. Their geography scores were widely varied, which led me to conclude that geography was not necessarily a key factor in a state being included here. Also, there was lots of variance on whether or not a country did have historical affinity towards China. But in general, states in this category did display somewhat higher degrees of military cooperation scores and rather varied economic dependence scores. So what I concluded from this is that states here don't necessarily possess any sort of long-standing ties or bonds, but they have made decisions to selectively engage in this military cooperation or economic arrangements when it does suit its interests. And these types of selective engagement are critical enough to distinguish them from low dynamic, low fixed states. And in sort of specific sectors that we see, I anticipate that you could see some degree of alignment between this group of states and Beijing in that more sector-specific context. And then finally, a thing to note is that there are several states that were borderline between the bottom left category, low dynamic, low fixed, and this category of high dynamic, low fixed. So I anticipate that as data is updated, there will perhaps be an increasing number of states that migrate to this high dynamic, low fixed category. The next group that we'll talk about is the low dynamic, high fixed category. So this was Algeria, Hungary, Nigeria, and South Korea. You can see there at the top left here. So first, what I'll say was interesting about this group is a lot of these states did have rather interesting historical linkages to China. For example, there was a strong relationship between both Hungary and Algeria and China around the time that the PRC was founded. And many of them, with the exception of South Korea, did share several regime characteristics with the PRC. And Algeria, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe shared relatively notable degrees of military cooperation, although scores within the economic dependence variable were again uneven across this category. Many states did have a high degree of affinity, but geography was mixed as well, indicating that proximity is not necessarily a prerequisite for states displaying this type of alignment. And then finally, states here do display this more interesting form of geopolitical connectivity where they do retain this historical level of cooperation and engagement, but they seem to have reduced levels of cooperation in specific sectors where it might potentially be controversial. And so I think that states within this category are several degrees removed from what we would conventionally term as allies. The final category is low dynamic, low fixed, which in short are states that are not aligned with China. So you'll see here, this is the largest category. We have several states, many of them in Europe, that are here. They're sort of in the bottom left right there. But again, going back to my earlier comment, there are many states that are sort of in this area that are on the borderline for potentially moving into this high dynamic, low fixed category. So states in this group did not share an adversary with the PRC historically, except for the United States. So that was an important finding, that states in this category generally did not have the sort of historical or current conceptions of a shared threat perception. Generally, these states can best be categorized as either non-aligned, or some states are even could be considered hostile to China's international objectives. And indeed, most of them did not display military cooperation, although there were some states within this low dynamic, low fixed category that did display rather high economic scores. So now I'm going to move on to the key findings that were sort of discernible after looking at this broader overlay of states. First, there is a notable and potentially growing group of states that are exhibiting alignment with Beijing, even if these alignments do fall short today of exhibiting an alliance-like bilateral relationship. So most notably, Pakistan, North Korea, and Russia consistently demonstrated that they shared regime characteristics. They had economic dependency, military cooperation, the presence of a shared adversary, and then again, this historical and geographic links. But again, these absence of firm commitments between China and this identified group does, in my opinion, leave gray area when trying to determine to what degree this exhibited alignment would actually have practical implications. The next key finding is that the existence of a shared adversary proved to be the best predictor of where states would fall within this alignment distribution. Originally, when I did this research, I anticipated that economic dependency would be a more powerful driver of where states were categorized, but I was incorrect. And this finding does challenge a lot of current analyses of China's Belt and Road Initiative that emphasize the potential impact of debt trap diplomacy. If we're going back to this finding that, again, does comport with existing alliance literature that talks about the impact of shared adversaries on alignment outcomes. Finally, there are a group of states that possess a high degree of economic cooperation on China, but very limited military cooperation. And this group of states does generally exhibit weaker alignment outcomes. So the Philippines, Turkey, and South Korea would be great examples here. And again, all of these states did exhibit a high degree of economic dependence, but this limited military cooperation was in many situations what kept them from being classified as, in a different typology category. And in my opinion, this reinforced some of the existing conclusions that there could potentially be a bifurcation in security and economic orders. But what I do think it raises the question of is, does this bifurcation and security and economic orders within the Indo-Pacific region actually have impacts on the broader geopolitical preferences and distribution of states? And these findings would suggest perhaps not. So the next steps for this project, this is a chapter currently within my PhD thesis, and I will be doing qualitative case study chapters on South Korea, Tanzania, and Russia that look at each of these variables in depth from a qualitative perspective. And I expect to further refine exactly how these definitions of the different categories of China's partnerships that I discussed at the beginning do connect to some of these existing definitional concepts. And I suppose with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Alessio.
I'm going to unmute myself. Excellent. I am unmuted until someone mutes me up again. Okay, so first of all, I was very pleased to be asked to comment on the chapter. I've read your work, as you know, for the upgrade, and I read this chapter and I tell myself, this is wonderful. This is exactly what anyone would wish to see, sort of progression in terms of PhD students, because a lot of the questions there that were raised in the upgrade context, now they all started to make sense, and you providing this absolutely stellar piece of work to put it together. In particular, as someone reads regularly a lot of published materials on China, and find a good 80% very boring, this was everything but. It was really sort of like refreshing, new. And as you say, a lot of your original hypothesis and assumption kind of like turns out on their heads once the findings comes across. So it's genuinely exciting. And in many respects, what is funny about this is that, as you say very clearly, that you stop with the data analysis and sort of the data uses down to 2018, actually fast forward to yesterday, and we start looking, some of your findings being proven correct, because countries like Sri Lanka, Maldives, they all started to question the extent to which they want to continue to evolve their relationship with China. So precisely the point that you were making in the end, how debt trap diplomacy doesn't necessarily mean greater alignment, right? So I think there's a lot there. Also, for me, the cases in this chapter that struck me the most were obviously Tanzania and South Korea. Because these are borderlines, and again, the fact that you're using them as case studies to, in a way, go qualitatively greater into exploring the validity of the framework you're providing is excellent to do it with these border cases, because it allows you to address concerns that someone who's coming from a qualitative perspective might have with a quantitatively sort of driven type of approach. So from my perspective, this is great. And again, all your conclusions, that bang on, and in a way, if anything, your work seem to be vindicated by reality as it unfolds in front of our eyes. So there's nothing more than anyone could ask of a young researcher. So that's fantastic. A couple of very minor points, or that more sort of suggestions for you to reflect upon. The military cooperation, right? And I like very much how you organize military cooperation, right? Sort of high-level visits, and then the joint exercises. So you create sort of like a 3-tiered space for that. I would perhaps suggest that only if you meet all of that, there's actual military cooperation. Say, for example, the case of Australia that you mentioned, right? And you make reference particularly to the aspect of military cooperation. Australia isn't really doing military cooperation. It's more like military interaction, maybe engagement. Cooperation is different in that regard. And if you look into the details of the type of joint exercises they've been doing, it's relatively basic stuff. It's not really sort of aimed at increasing cooperation. It's more like deconflicting, if you want, from a military perspective. And I wonder whether military interaction as opposed to cooperation might sort of be more befitting, if you want, of the fact that in that category, you could have a medium-sized result that actually doesn't translate into cooperation. If tomorrow something happens, it's not that the Chinese can rely on the Australians to work together and find a solution to it, right? In that regard. So I thought that was like, cooperation implies more. And that sort of brings me to my final and slightly bigger point about what I thought was in the presentation, because I think in the presentation you integrated something from the previous chapter on the difference, and thank you for doing that, because my fear was like, if everybody's just read the chapter and doesn't know the previous bits, there's going to be a little bit of a confusion between alliances and alignment. So that was really helpful. But then at the same time, it kind of got me to think, is perhaps alliances as a construct, right? It's very much about ascertaining the things that you have to do and the things that you don't have to do, right? And then there's a space of like, well, we're not really sure because of the formality of it. So it is very much about to do and not to do list. Whereas the idea of alignment, particularly the very good way in which you kind of say, like, look at the Chinese use all these 10,000 different expressions, let's throw them away and let's try to think about substance, and substance-wise is perhaps more than to do and not to do. It's more about managing expectation, this idea of interest and commonality sort of converging. Is the Chinese model not designed to be sure that in a time of crisis and need, you know what the other guy is going to do for you or not do for you, but rather to manage every other moment in your life in international relations, which is managing expectation, pushing and asking at every time. And the example that I have in my mind is the very different ways in which in Western research centers, we assessed the results and the position worldwide of the 2016 award in the case between China and the Philippines, and the way the Chinese did, right? Basically, the Chinese considered a win anybody who didn't clearly say, oh, the award is right, the Chinese are wrong, everybody should behave accordingly. And for them, a win was everybody else, which kind of like speaks to this more nuanced, right? And geared towards sort of managing the degree of expectation, right? I'm happy so long so you're not clearly against me, right? So it's moving away from identifying the clearly spaces where an ally or a partner is responsible to do something, but the Chinese actually try to focus on everything else, which is, I don't really want to know what position is or is not. I just want to know that you're not against me in that sort of thing. And from there, building some more. And I wonder whether there is something more to be said about the framework you created, right? Understanding this concept of alignment. What does it mean to the Chinese, right? Why do they do that? Because at the end of the day, it seems to me that they are coming around in the high fixed, high dynamic into a very formal, almost Western-like posture, but not quite yet. So if when they want something, they end up in the same space, perhaps what they really want most of the time is something else. What is that something else? Do you have any thoughts about it? Thank you.
Thanks so much. First, I'll just speak briefly about the Australia point, and I think that that does raise a great question about whether or not interaction versus cooperation is the best term to use there. And there is very interesting discussion literature as well as to what degree is this military interaction that you've described actually a form of either risk reduction or a way of Australia, and in many cases the US, who also would participate sort of trilaterally or as an observer in these opportunities for interaction, to be you know, an opportunity for them to in some ways gain more knowledge about the PLA versus have, you know, discrete cooperative outcomes. So that was definitely something both within the Australia and the India context that I think was hard to square between the quantitative outcomes and the qualitative outcomes. So I think that is an important gap to emphasize within the quantitative results alone. On this broader question of what China wants, you know, outside of the, you know, perhaps this high fixed, high dynamic category, where I do agree that in a few years it might progress more towards these formalized concepts of alliance. I do think that better defining what it is they seek to get out of these high, you know, high fixed, low dynamics cases, and then the low fixed, high dynamic cases will be particularly interesting to watch, because there perhaps it is, you know, within the South Korea case, which is one of the qualitative cases, it's simply, you know, buying indifference in a way, right? As indifference to them a form of acceptable alignment. And I think understanding how these peripheral cases, right, fit within the broader, you know, balanced power and broader dynamics too, will be critically important for understanding how US alliance architectures then interface with this alignment system that China's building. So that's a very helpful suggestion, and I think will be great for fleshing out more both within the introduction of the thesis as well as sort of in the concluding bits as well. Thanks.
Great. Gosh, I'm learning so much. Again, I'm not a subject matter expert, but just listening to your presentation in the broader dialogue, this is so fascinating. So my question isn't, I'm abusing my right of chair, by the way, just to ask you a question. And it's more to reflect upon your process as a, you know, through your research. And I wonder if you can reflect on when you first started pre-upgrade to now, like, has your question changed at all, or have you found any key surprises along the way, or has your like modeling changed? I guess if you just want to, if you can reflect, has it been like this, you know, like what we imagine an ideal PhD trajectory, or is it more just wanting you to reflect a bit on that, if you don't mind?
Yeah, happy to. So I will say that when I did, I think the research question itself perhaps has remained relatively constant, but one that I think has changed a bit more is exactly how the quantitative model would be employed. And I think when I was at the outset, I didn't necessarily even know if that was something for sure that I wanted to do. But coming from a US context, you know, it's hard to get away from quantitative approaches to political science. So I thought it was important that I at least try. And then if it didn't work out, you know, maybe sort of jump ship and move to a solely qualitative approach. But I think I was fortunate that when a lot of the data sources, I did start putting them together. To be honest, I was very concerned that when I sort of did all the quantitative aspects, the data model that would come out would bear no resemblance to reality. But I was fortunate that, you know, once the data did start coming in, it did, I think, paint a picture that I think comports in some way with what people would have thought qualitatively. So that in a way sort of validated my thought. So I do think another piece, though, that is important is how the data itself is changing over the course of the project. And I think a good example, and I mentioned Australia briefly on the slide, but the trade data, the most recent piece that's come out is from 2018. And I am actually anticipating that when, eventually when I submit next year, there will be perhaps some updates that perhaps move countries slightly on the distribution, which could be challenging, if I'm trying to wrap up the project, right, and things are shifting. And then finally, when I did the upgrade, I presented sort of a preliminary version of this model where I only included a few countries. I think it's been nice to see after the upgrade to build it out more and include more than just the preliminary few that I included.
Great. Thank you for that. Thank you for those reflections. And I think those are so invaluable for new PhDs and PhDs along the road to realize that this process is normal, right? That sort of weaving in different directions is absolutely normal and is kind of what we expect, and to leave ourselves open to surprises and to going down different pathways as we're doing this research. So that's fab. You've got some questions from your supervisor now. So I'm going to read them out loud because she's lost her voice. So the first question is, to what extent do you think the different language terms used to describe Chinese partnerships is significant? For example, the difference between all round versus all weather. And do these terms get dropped? Can they move up to another category? That's the first question. So you got that? I'm going to ask you now her second question, okay? Are you okay? Yeah?
Yeah, that's great, yeah.
Okay, the second question is, although your project doesn't include COVID period since 2020, do you find the so-called Wolf-style period, 2020. Do you find the so-called Wolf-style diplomacy, if you agree with the term, problematic for the alignment partners? Did I read that well? That was kind
Yes, seeing folks not familiar with wolf warrior type diplomacy then be forced to interact with it, I think made my morning. So I guess I'll start with question number 2. So for those that are unfamiliar with the term, the wolf warrior diplomacy refers to, I guess, what could be described as the belligerent behavior of many of Chinese diplomatic officials on Twitter, where in ways they criticize or in sometimes accost, put out press statements that in many ways I think partner countries perhaps find unhelpful and in some cases offensive. I think a pointed example is the Chinese embassy in France put out a statement criticizing the number of COVID deaths in French nursing homes, which obviously went, over very poorly with the French population. And I think this question is actually very interesting because one of the indicators within the affinity variable is the Pew Research Attitudes Survey, and they actually just had a new edition drop last week that I have not yet integrated in this model, but you saw China's unfavorability ratings just going through the roof, right? So I do think it will have a very tangible impact, at least quantitatively, on the model. And again, that could be something that moves countries back into this low dynamic, low fixed category. So I think certainly it will be problematic, and I think it will be harder then for countries to gain popular support for perhaps these more pronounced alignment outcomes. Back to the first question, whether or not there's a difference between these terms, I guess I'll start by saying I think China sees a difference, but the question is whether or not the partner country that they're engaging with appreciates that nuance that China is applying to their relationship. And I think at least anecdotally, you've heard that countries perhaps are like, okay, we'll sign up for this partnership and we'll have bilateral dialogue mechanisms. And to them, perhaps it seems very, low risk. But I think what is unclear is what values China assigns to that partnership framework. And then countries have in the past progressed up the ladder. You could say they've started out as a lower tier, and then after 3 to 5 years, they've sort of been elevated. And usually China will make a very big stink of it, and it'll be an outcome in whatever, official bilateral head of state visit. So it'll be frequently treated as a deliverable within foreign policy engagements to be elevated on the ladder.
Right. Thank you. So Alessio, you had a follow-up question. Did you want to pose it now?
I was just tagging myself on the back of Nicola's wolf warrior diplomacy question. But just a quick two finger. I think the two case studies that you are looking at, not so much Russia, but Tanzania and South Korea, are going to be really interesting in this regard, because the Pew survey that you mentioned, from the headlines, South Korea was coming across as one of the countries in which perception of China had gone sort of more on the negative side than before. Not incredibly, it's not like the United States or Japan where you go into 80s, 90%, but still there was a minor change in that sense. And it seems to me that it's going to be interesting also to compare it with some of the fixed variables that you have there, particularly the proximity, the sort of shared moments in history, as it were. That's going to be interesting to see whether and to what extent that actually affects how South Korea changes and moves across the spectrum, more than Tanzania. I didn't look at the data on Tanzania, but it would be interesting to see that proximity, distance, and that sort of shared elements of history being sort of added or having a cumulative effect with the changing of public opinion. But absolutely, very fascinating stuff happening.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think, South Korea is the only case study that I've actually finished writing as well. And definitely the THAAD dispute, as well as the sort of historical Japan element too, I think plays interesting in the shared adversary calculations. So it was a fun chapter.
Great. So we do have a question from Mervyn Frost. So Mervyn, go ahead.
Hi, this is not my subject area, but I found this all very interesting. And I just have this quick question for Abigail. As I look at it, the analysis seems quite static. And I wanted to ask, did, for example, the United States shift from one administration to the next? So, from Obama to Trump, and if we get Joe Biden next, will that make a difference? Or do you think these interests and positions are static? Thank you.
Thanks. So I guess I'll start by saying for the US, I don't necessarily anticipate that in the US context, political dynamics would necessarily change these outcomes, though it might have small impacts on the relative position of the US within that low dynamic, low fixed category. So a good example I can think of is actually the military cooperation interaction variable that I was discussing in the Australia context. So prior to this administration, the US did sort of engage in minor sort of what they frame as risk reduction engagements with China, and that has not continued at pace in the current administration. So I think that's potentially an area where on the margins, the US's relative position could shift slightly, but I don't necessarily think that would result in a recategorization of the US. However, I do think in other contexts, Tanzania, which we've been discussing, they've had an election, I think it was over a year ago, and did have political leadership come in with perhaps different opinions towards China. So I think that in other countries where there's not as an entrenched position that's really driven by structural outcomes, those sorts of recategorizations are more likely.
Oh, thanks very much. That helps a lot.
Gosh, this is so fascinating. Do we have any other questions at the moment? No one else is raising their hands. I'm just enjoying listening to this dialogue. So I'll just wait another minute or two to see. So Abigail, how far along of the PhD are you? How many chapters, empirical chapters do you have written?
Yeah, so I think it'll be 7 chapters altogether, including the introduction and the conclusion. And so I finished 4 of them. And so what I have left to write are the final 2 case studies of Tanzania and Russia, and then the conclusion. And then obviously editing all of the other pieces that facts on the ground have sort of resulted in changes since they were initially written. So maybe about a year left, I think. Although Nicola can correct me if she thinks that's off track.
I mean, I guess in terms of seeing your PhD in the broader project as a book, then what is the, I guess, key contribution? If you can give an elevator pitch, right? What is the key contribution that your PhD turned into a book? Because it sounds like it needs to be a book. What will that do? What contribution do you want to make?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start by saying one of my original drivers to pursue the project was China's own, vehement insistence that it doesn't pursue alliances and that this sort of behavior does not comport with its approach to, geopolitical interactions. And I guess I wanted to interrogate that question and see whether or not that assertion they were making from a policy perspective was actually borne out in the facts. So I think first it will assist those who are seeking to understand how China's emerging relationships with any of these countries, does sort of fit into this broader picture of what they are pursuing. And I think also the question of how we look at alliances within, the broader IR field. Certainly, a lot of work on alliances right now is very quantitative in nature and heavily reliant on the existence of those formal treaty documents in order for, a country to even be considered within that quantitative field of study. And so I think that from an IR perspective, that perspective is a bit too limiting. And I think that hopefully this will encourage scholars who aren't necessarily China experts, but do work on alliances, as a field of study, to think more about how China's behavior is worthy of study and merit in this field, and should be in dialogue with their existing findings, which are in many ways very historically based and stretch back, centuries into looking at perhaps alliance patterns in a Western context.
Can I just be absolutely unbearable and ask another question? I'm absolutely naughty. Okay, so the one thing that so South Korea is so interesting for so many different points of view in terms of the research that you're doing. One element, particularly right now, is the question of you're taking a Chinese perspective and approach to this, right? But in the case of South Korea, there is an added element, and that is South Koreans' own alliance arrangements with others, i.e. the United States. So to what extent, in this regard, in that particular context, the current slightly more stormy weather in the United States, South Korea, security ties, and the conversation taking place on the alliance arrangements contributes, if you want, to create that sort of borderline position as almost as an opportunity, if you look at it from a South Korean perspective, right? As a neighbor of China, as a rising power that has risen, China could provide some of the, if you want, support that the South Koreans want in terms of stability of the Korean Peninsula, because after all, North Korea is a close partner of China. So to what extent, the fact that South Korea, it's an interesting border case, to what extent the external factor that we haven't considered, that is South Koreans' alliance with the United States, may play a role in how there's, that position and that spectrum changes.
And so I will say that was one of the reasons why I wanted to spend a lot of time on these qualitative chapters, is because that is an opportunity to explore exactly the dynamic you're discussing. And in the section that's devoted to military cooperation, in the South Korea chapter, I do spend a lot of time talking about how in many ways South Korea's very low military score is actually what kept it from being included in that high fixed, high dynamic category. So in that sense, the existence of this strong military cooperation between the US and South Korea, this isn't frequently discussed, but the US does have, operational control of South Korea's military. It's an extremely integrated and embedded system, and would be quite challenging for South Korea to unwind in any way, just from a bureaucratic perspective. So I did highlight that particular element as actually the limiting factor that in many ways was sort of the barrier between South Korea then pursuing this additional type of cooperation and then moving into that high fixed, high dynamic category. So I do think the degree to which the alliance between, the US and South Korea phrase that and only presents an opportunity to China, right? If it's looking to find more states to fit into this more aligned grouping.
Well, that's wonderful. I think, gosh, Abby, I think you're almost right for your Viva, the way you respond to the questions with such, confidence, and you clearly know your stuff, and that's showing through. So thank you so much for presenting your work. I think if there's no other questions, we'll let you off the hook a little bit, have your cup of tea and relax. I want to thank you so much for presenting your work here today. Fascinating stuff. fascinating. And then Alessio, I want to thank you so much for being a discussant and for really engaging in this work too. I learned a lot from your comments, and Supervisor Nicola for asking those tough, cheeky questions. And same with you, Mervyn, for asking important questions too. And finally to the audience for coming along and listening to a really great talk, and another fantastic PhD student we have in war studies and the School of Security Studies. So very pleased. Just a big kind of quiet round of applause for everyone, especially for you, Abigail. And thank you all. Next Wednesday, we have another PhD student presenting some fab research. So if you're interested, please pop in. Abigail, this will be recorded, like I said, or it's being recorded, but it will be circulated through social media channels with the School of Security Studies, Defense Studies, and War Studies, their media channels, as well as on the Defense Studies and War Studies webpage under the link New Voices. So if you want to hear again, listen to this talk again, please do visit. So again, thank you all for coming out. You have a great afternoon, and yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you.